Marvelous Marvin Hagler has to be considered to be one of the best, if not the greatest, middleweight boxer of all time. From looking from the outside, his hard work and discipline is something anyone can admire. He was known for his ferociousness in his fights against the likes of Hearns, Mugabe and Leonard. However, people forget there was a lot more to Hagler than just those fights. Marvelous was in fact a tremendous boxer who used a vast array of skills throughout his career. In this boxing style analysis video today, I'll be taking a closer look at Hagler's tremendous overall skill set and what I hope will continue his legacy. But first, let's have a quick overview of the Marvelous One's boxing career. Born in Newark, New Jersey, Hagler first put on a pair of boxing gloves at the age of 10. It was from this point it looked written in the stars. Growing up, he would pretend he was the likes of Floyd Patterson or Emil Griffith, who I can see elements in his own style. But due to the riots in Newark in 1967 that caused much damage to his family's property, Hagler's family moved to Brockton, Massachusetts. It was here a couple of years later a young Marvin would get roughed up by a local boxer on the street, whom he would later defeat. It was from here a young Hagler was determined to become a boxer himself, so this wouldn't happen again. He would walk into the gym owned by Pat and Goody Petronelli, who would become his trainers and managers. Hagler would turn amateur, but had to lie about his age to become one, where he ended up having a successful amateur career, which included a US National Championship, and him finishing on a record of 55-1. Hagler would then turn professional and very much had to do it the hard way to get to the top of the sport. He struggled to find high profile opponents to face. Many claimed it was because he was a southpaw, which many fighters would avoid back then, with Hagler and his team having to list themselves as orthodox and even fight as orthodox so they could line up other fights. No doubt this helped him with the birth of his switch hitting skill set. Joe Frazier also once famously said to Hagler, "You have 3 strikes against you. You're black, you're southpaw, and you're good." Hagler would have much success for the most part in his early career, but did have some controversial decision losses and a draw on his record. However, Marvelous was able to avenge them all with knockouts, and was eventually picked up and signed by legendary promoter Bob Arum. It would take Marvin Hagler 50 fights before he got his first title fight against Vito Antuofermo in Las Vegas, going 15 rounds. Unfortunately for Marvin, it would end in disappointment once again in a split decision draw. However, it wouldn't be long before he would get his shot against Alan Minter, who defeated Antuofermo. After 54 fights, Hagler would become undisputed middleweight champion. From here, he would go on to have 13 title defences in some of the most famous fights against the likes of Hearns, Duran, Mugabe, Simpson and many more. In particular, the fight against Tommy Hearns was regarded as one of the most brutal in boxing, with round 1 being regarded as the greatest round in boxing history. If you haven't watched it, make sure you do. Hagler would then finish his career in a super fight versus Sugar Ray Leonard, where he lost by split decision in a close fight, but with many feeling he won the fight clearly. It was this fight which would end up being the Marvelous One's last in what was truly a legendary career. Hagler's boxing style. Now let's get onto the actual elements of Hagler's boxing style. Now, as someone who didn't really study Hagler many years until after his retirement, many often get drawn to at first his classic fights against the likes of Hearns, Mugabe and Leonard, where you could easily have mistaken him for having a very aggressive brawler style. However, that was very much just one element of Hagler's style, as he could very much as well box on the back foot, counterpunch and use his jab all night. I'd very much say he was more of a cautious boxer-puncher if you look at his career as a whole, where he was able to in fact adapt to the opponent he was facing. Hagler is in no way the fastest fighter we've seen, but it was his extremely good punch timing from either southpaw or orthodox stances that made him so effective, while his footwork was also a huge part of his success as a fighter. You could also tell Marvin was a very fit and well-trained fighter, which helped him able to turn up the gas when he needed to. But let's get into some of the more individual elements of his style now. Switch hitting. As mentioned already, Hagler would often have to fight out of an orthodox stance in his early career to get the fights he wanted. This would no doubt be a big factor in him learning to be a switch hitter at times as he progressed throughout his career. He would use this very much to take advantage of the opponent's angles and movements, while also adding an element of unpredictability of what stance he would fight in. For the most part, Hagler was best as a southpaw, and he would have much of a success in this stance in my opinion. It would also help he was right-handed and was very capable of throwing strong lead right hooks or powerful right crosses from the orthodox stance. One of the best ways Hagler would be able to quickly change stance was by using the shift technique. This would help him quickly apply more pressure on the opponent to catch them off guard by throwing his backhand before quickly shifting into the other stance before throwing another follow-up punch. I recommend you check out my shift technique video to find out more about this. The jab. Now this is another part of Hagler's style that doesn't get talked about, and that is of course his terrific jab. As mentioned, Hagler was at his best as a southpaw. It also helped that he was naturally right-handed, which made this punch so devastating at times. Another advantage he has was his long reach of 75 inches for a man at 5'9", which made his jab very deceptive. Marvelous would very much use the jab by throwing it heavily to the head and to the body. He would also double up and even triple up the punch to push back his opponent, or even just to create a bit of distance. But most famously, Hagler would use the gazelle jab or punch. This is no doubt something he took from one of his boxing inspirations, Floyd Patterson, who used this often. For the gazelle jab or punch, he would shuffle forward slightly before he would put his weight on the front foot before leaping forward into the punch. This would be a great way for Marvelous to find ways to get into range. He would also use this sometimes as an opportunity to change stance and continue the pressure. I also have another whole video on the gazelle punch technique if you want to check that out. Feinting. A huge part of Marvin Hagler's ability was his tremendous use of constant feints. For me, he has to be one of the very best to use them so efficiently. Never at one point would Hagler's body or head position be in the same place. He would always be using jerking-like movements to keep his competitors cautious whether he would throw a punch or not. It made Hagler in fact a very difficult opponent to hit cleanly or time. It would also stop more aggressive fighters from overcommitting, as Hagler was very capable of catching them with big counter punches rushing in. In terms of setting up his attack, he would usually move his head before throwing a punch combination, while he would also use foot feints alongside this to see how his opponents would react to him, coming in and out of range. Similar examples of fighters using feints like this in more recent times include the likes of Manny Pacquiao and even Tyson Fury. Footwork. Another part of Hagler's arsenal was of course his marvellous footwork. For the most part, Hagler really did have amazing rhythm when in the ring, but with the combination of his upper body feints and head movement, it made it very difficult to attack or hit him cleanly. Hagler was one of the best at punching and moving, but instead of moving back in straight lines, he would use great lateral movements to get out and restart his offensive. Sometimes he would even use this as a way to continue his attack. In terms of his offense, like all great southpaws, he was very good at getting his foot on the outside of orthodox opponents, which in turn would help set up his straight left down the middle. For me, we saw some of his best boxing footwork when he faced southpaws such as Hamcho and Minter, where he would circle to the right before firing heavy right-handed jabs or hooks to catch them off guard. Another aspect I'd like to mention was that he was also capable of applying pressure on his opponents with footwork, slowly creeping forward before attacking and countering his opponent. However, Hagler always maintained his bouncing jerky-like rhythm when he was coming into range. Defense. When you think of Hagler, his defense abilities are probably the last thing you think of. But Marvin Hagler was in fact very defensive throughout the majority of his career. As I've discussed so far, his feints and footwork would work together in making him an elusive target for the majority of his competitors. Like I've said already in this video, it was all about hitting and moving out the way for the Marvelous One. It's something people don't seem to appreciate until you watch some of his less famous fights. But to talk about other elements of his defense, Hagler had very good upper body and head movement as discussed. He was very much able to slip incoming jabs and quickly counter them. He was also one of the best at rolling incoming hooks before quickly moving out the way. He would also parry punches away with his higher guard. Or when he had to, use the traditional high guard to catch shots. As a defensive boxer, Hagler was very much marvellous at it. Inside fighter. Hagler's inside fighting was also very good for the most part, and when his opponents were hurt or starting to tire, this was his opportunity to get to work on the inside. First, he would look to use arm or shoulders to control his opponent before throwing sharp uppercuts up the middle. He would also make sure to lean his head on the opponent's shoulder so he could protect his own chin. Against Mugabe, we saw some brilliant work in Hagler's exchanges on the inside, where he would catch shots with his arms and guard before immediately countering, while also changing his body position. Hagler, of course, would come out on top, landing far more. For the most part, Hagler was very capable of handling himself on the inside, and I think the vast majority of opponents struggled to win the battle with him, especially as he was so physically fit and strong. Brawler and finisher. Now I wanted to finish with Hagler turning into a bit of a brawler in his last few fights, which he was very capable of fighting in this style. I think after he defeated Tommy Hearns in devastating fashion in their legendary fight, Hagler no doubt felt he could approach that way against anyone. In a way, this has inspired many fighters in having this war come forward mentality, but the thing I want to point out is that although Hagler had a far more aggressive approach in these last fights, he had still developed an incredible skill set on top of this, as I've discussed throughout this video. This should be a warning for fighters wanting to fight like Hagler in the last few fights, but I do think it shows sometimes as fighters, we have to go broke and take the fight to your opponent, regardless of who is in front of you. Maybe if Hagler approached the Hearns fight more cautiously, he would have lost, like he had done in the past. But he clearly didn't want to take the chance on relying on the judges' scorecards, which had disappointed him already in his career. Hagler, without a doubt, could have fought like this his whole career, but would he have lasted as long as he did? To end on a more positive note, there's no denying Hagler was a tremendous finisher with 52 knockouts from his 62 wins. I wouldn't necessarily say Marvelous was a one-punch KO artist, but instead was very meticulous at breaking guys down over the rounds before he would catch them with his killer blow.
McCarthy says don't push, there's the right hand, Hampshire is down, he will not get up.
Final thoughts guys, this video was very much a tribute to Marvelous Marvin Hagler, who passed away in March 2021. Hagler was not in any way in my era of boxing growing up. Instead, I found out about him when I started my own boxing journey. Once I began learning and studying the history of the sweet science, it was clear Hagler was the go-to fighter to watch. This is why I love this sport, as you can learn so much from fighters from the past. In the case of Hagler, he is very much one of the names many will continue to look back on due to his legacy in the ring. I hope this video will continue that legacy and help inspire up-and-coming boxers and fans in years to come to learn about the Marvelous One, as Hagler was truly marvellous inside and out the ring. Rest in peace, champ. And that wraps up this video guys. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button. If you're new here, please subscribe. Let me know in the comments below what your favourite Marvelous Marvin Hagler moment was. I'd love to know. If there's another boxer you'd like me to cover, comment below as well. As always guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
To get to this level, I had to fight hard in life and in the ring. Every time it was a challenge to prove to myself that I can do it. And my determination gave me the strength to go on and store my dreams, which I had promised my grandfather that the world will one day know his name, Hagler, and it will be remembered forever.